thank you for this warm welcome. Honorable Minister, Dr. Subramanian, Mr. Kumar, Dr. Prasad, distinguished participants, and dear guests. It's an honor for me to welcome you all on behalf of the German government to this workshop, especially on behalf of the Federal Ministry of Environment, who is supporting the program of the GIZ. Looking at the agenda, I expect a very fruitful discussion. I'm very interested to hear what comes out of this workshop. As a member of the German embassy, of course, you'd expect me to tell you something about the German politics on climate finance and climate protection in general. So I will do that, as to not to disappoint you. Climate change, I think most scientists agree, is maybe the biggest global challenge of our days. And to reach the 2 degrees target, courageous and active climate policy is needed. Therefore, during the Lima conference, taking place last December, the German government announced an action program for climate protection 2020, which has been lauded by many people as a consistent climate protection measure catalogue. It has a value, or it's worth around $104 billion of investment in climate adaptation mitigation measures. The German government also has decided, and I'm sure you all know about it, has decided to lead the way in transforming its energy system, something we call the Energiewende, which means to follow 2 legs. One is focus on renewable energies, and they already contribute about 25% to our electricity consumption. And the second leg is to increase energy efficiency, so to use less energy. The German economy has succeeded in decoupling its growth from CO2 emissions. German economy has grown about 37% since the 90s, while the emissions were dropping by about 25%. The emission target is a minus 40% by 2030, and that's in line with the officially communicated EU INDCs communicated to UNFCCC. But on international climate financing, the commitments by countries have grown strongly since Copenhagen, but a lot more is needed. I think everyone agrees on that. Germany is one of the largest donors on climate finance. In 2013 alone, over $2.3 billion have been contributed to climate finance. The 3 years before, $7.8 billion. In Lima, we announced an extra $70 million for the adaptation fund. For the Green Climate Fund, Germany announced about $1 billion and was the first one to announce its contribution to the initial contribution to the Green Climate Fund. The target has been fulfilled, and we would see it as a strong signal for the commitment of industrialized countries to actually contribute to the financing. But you're right that capitalization of the Green Climate Fund is key for conclusion of an ambitious climate agreement in Paris later this year. And therefore, that's why the German government tries to facilitate and negotiates how much more we can contribute. Tries to also facilitate, the funds flowing in. And one of the initiatives I want to mention is the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which is not a German initiative, but is supported by Germany. And the first phase was just concluded. Results were presented in New York on April 16th. over 80 innovative ideas have been presented to trigger financing, also from the private sector, to mobilize private investment into climate financing. And 4 of these ideas have been selected for implementation. For example, within the G7, where Germany has the presidency this year. Another intense discussion was the Major Economies Forum, which just took place in Washington. G7 summit taking place in June in Germany will hopefully bring some progress, because Germany sort of feels responsibility to enhance the discussion within the G7, because the G7 are the major financing countries, major donors, as they over 80% they contributed to the Green Climate Fund by now. This is in short some highlights from the German perspective. I welcome you all. I thank you for being here, Minister, and I wish us all a very fruitful discussion.
Experience, excellence in academics, and a clear and honorable Minister of State for Finance, Shri Jayant Sinha, with us. And now may I kindly request him to make his inaugural address.
First, I must say that I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to be with you all this morning to speak about a topic that is very close to my heart. Among the challenges facing India, it's very clear that climate change is among the top 3. We have a real climate change set of challenges that we have to deal with. And the very fact that weather has been changing in these unexpected ways, and that we've had these very different weather patterns from what we have over centuries experienced. And it's fascinating to see how our own agriculture and our farming practices have developed. I come from a very rural and very agricultural state in Jharkhand. And as I travel around, I see how the habits, the traditions, and the manners in which people continue their agricultural practices have very deep roots in our society and in our way of life. And when these weather patterns begin to change, it actually changes the way of life and the way in which people sustain themselves, because these are very deep-rooted habits that they have acquired over centuries, in fact. And we've seen with the recent hailstorms and the fact that we've had very unseasonable rains, that it really becomes very, very disruptive, and it really, really has a big impact on people's lives. So how climate is changing and the very unexpected and volatile ways in which it's manifesting itself, either through hailstorms or unseasonal rains or a longer monsoon or a more erratic monsoon, and frankly also by the nature and severity of the cyclones that we are experiencing. It tells you that this is a very central and important challenge that we will have to deal with, not just in the next few years, but over the next decades as well. And so we really have to gear ourselves up to be able to deal with this. And that brings us to the third major challenge that we face as a society and a country, which is on the institutional side. And when we talk about the institutional side, there are multiple aspects there as well. We have to talk about regulations, we have to talk about policy making, we have to talk about expertise. And I think the good news is that through sessions like today, we are building our expertise and our understanding and our shared understanding how we can deal with all of this. But there's a third aspect to the whole institutional side, and that is around financing, which is something I know a lot about, having been for decades an investor as well. And unless we are able to have the money, the resources, and the financing available to deal with all of these changes in climate, it's going to be very difficult for us to be able to both mitigate as well as adapt what we are likely to see as carbon emissions continue to increase. So that is why climate financing becomes so important, because it enables us to really find a way to deal with the climate change challenges that we're dealing with right now. For instance, crop insurance, right? I mean, that is something we're not going to spend time on it, I think, today, but crop insurance becomes a very necessary way in which we have to deal with these changes to climate as well. But even as we talk about what governments are doing, even as we talk about what governments are doing with respect to climate financing, being a private sector person, I have to emphasize that if we genuinely want to scale up, and we genuinely want to make sure that technologies that can help us adapt and mitigate, whether it is crop insurance, which is a technology of some kind, of a kind as well, or whether it is renewable technologies or other mechanisms for dealing with climate change, the reality is that the private sector is going to be the prime mover and the prime agent in actually helping us deal with the financing of these climate amelioration technologies. And so we really have to look to the private sector for large-scale solutions that can be scaled up and which can get to every home, every village, and every community in India and around the world. Otherwise, it's not going to be possible for government to do it by itself, because we really need the private sector to step in. And so one of the messages that I have been communicating quite intensively is that we have to innovate in India for India. We have to innovate in India for India, and if we don't get the private sector to be innovating in India to deal with these climate change challenges that we have, we are not going to be able to scale it up. We are not going to be able to attract sufficient financing. We cannot look to the public sector. We really have to look to the private sector for solutions. And so one of the very important initiatives that the government is undertaking, and we've communicated that through the budget as well, is to really build up the entrepreneurial and innovation ecosystem in India so that we can in fact develop the solutions that will be successful in India. And just to illustrate that, I'd like to give you all an example. And it's about solar home systems in Bangladesh. They have created a fund which provides a first loss guarantee on solar home system. This is a very clever, innovative way of making sure that a renewable energy technology really is very, very quickly scaled up across a very, very poor country in some ways, but still, becomes very much an important part of the whole climate change challenge. Now, similarly, we have to think in India how we can come up with innovative solutions where domestic venture capital, domestic private equity, some kind of innovative financing arrangements and so on with public sector support make it possible for us to enable very valuable solutions like solar home systems to take off. Now, solar home systems is a very good example. Solar lanterns is another very good example. But I think that we can also start to imagine and conceive of even more interesting out-of-the-box solutions. And one thing I have been thinking about for a long time is why isn't it that we have an entire ecosystem that makes it possible for us to use electric motorcycles. Now, we are very good in India in making motorcycles. We have some of the most durable, most affordable, best engineered motorcycles, but obviously they run on petrol. And we are obviously importing the petrol, and there are significant carbon emissions associated with the use of petrol to power all the millions and millions of motorcycles that we have in India. But if, for instance, we built an ecosystem where there were 3 or 4 panels on rooftops, and people were able to charge their motorcycles through those rooftops, those panels could also then be used for obviously electricity and powering light and TV and so on, but they could also power motorcycles. This is an ecosystem that can be developed in India. It's innovate in India for India, and when we start to make these electric motorcycles in volume in India, it's a fantastic make in India story as well. And so this is the way I think we've got to think win-win-win across multiple dimensions. We can innovate in India, create really good wealth and return generation opportunities because we come up with these new products and services. We are able to then manufacture in India because we have the mass markets for something like electric motorcycles. And then number 3, we can then also export from India once we have these electric motorcycles, because I'm sure whether it's Vietnam or Indonesia or Nigeria, there will be tremendous demand for these kinds of electric motorcycles. And finally, once we have these electric motorcycles, because it's renewable energy, we're bringing down our oil consumption. So that's the way, if we think carefully about these kinds of solutions, whether it's electric motorcycles, whether it's solar home systems, or it's smokeless chulhas, we can in fact be able to create these kinds of solutions that will enable us to deal with both the mitigation as well as the adaptation challenges associated with climate change. And so I would very much hope that as you all think about climate change financing, you think about how this kind of financing can be applied to these kinds of innovations, these kinds of solutions that can really, really make a big difference across all these different dimensions. Thank you very much, and I'm sure you will have a wonderful set of sessions this evening.
I want to break down my remarks into two parts. First, to give you context, and the context obviously to the big event at the end of the year, which is going to be Paris. And in the second part, I'm going to talk about, what kind of should be the content of discussions at Paris. The climate change negotiations, the COP, 19? 21, COP 21. Okay, what is the context to COP 21? I think there's an international context and there's a domestic Indian context. The international context, I think, is really important. And I think it's characterized by one big fact. That big fact, recent fact, is that international energy prices have declined by about 45 to 50%, depending on how you calculate it, which is one of the biggest setbacks to climate change in recent times, because it's going to, once again, all the efforts made on conservation, on green technologies and so on are going to be set back. And against this context, the advanced countries have sat by passively without taking any offsetting action. So point number one is, this is actually de facto, default carbon subsidization by the advanced countries. And I haven't heard any outrage against this, certainly not within India, but certainly not internationally. I like to ask all the Greens of the world, where are you when oil prices, energy prices decline 50%? All the major countries pass on these to consumers, do not take offsetting action, set back the process of climate change, and not one, there's no outrage here. There should be more outrage. So that's the international context. What is the domestic context, the Indian context? A huge contrast. I think in the last 6 or 7 months, I'm going to list out 6 or 7 developments in India that really offer such a, welcome and sharp contrast to this inaction by the advanced countries. How is India? India is burnishing its green credentials in 5 or 6 very important ways. One, as oil prices declined, while the West sat and twiddled its thumbs, we imposed excises on diesel and petroleum. And in the economic survey, we calculate that effectively we've gone from a carbon subsidization regime to an effective carbon tax regime on petroleum and diesel, about $120 per ton CO2 for petrol and about $70 per ton diesel. So a major, contribution to climate change by the excises on diesel. Second, as the minister mentioned, we've quadrupled the cess on coal from 50 rupees a ton to 200 rupees a ton in the last few years, and that's going to reduce emissions by a substantial amount, fair amount, not substantial, modest, but significant amount, again documented in the economic survey. Third action, a little bit unwitting, accidental, but the 14th Finance Commission, in conditioning transfers based on forest cover, if you look at the 14th Finance Commission recommendations, for the first time, forest cover is a criterion for allocating resources to the states. So the calculation by the Center for Global Development in Washington is that $9 billion are going to be given towards basically afforestation, which is going to be an incentive to plant forests in the future and thereby also contribute. The calculation is something like $125 per hectare of forest per year, which is 3-4 times than any other afforested country, Costa Rica, Indonesia, etc., etc. 4, of course, the solar mission announced by the Prime Minister, very ambitious, to go from 20 gigawatts to 100 gigawatts. Again, a major contribution to climate change. And I think point number 5, which I think in some ways has a lot of long-term potential, I think if you look at all these articles, and Jyoti Parekh is in the audience, she's also written on this, the domestic politics of outrage against pollution and climate change is really taking off very significantly in India. The Prime Minister launched this, pollution monitoring index. So in some ways, this is becoming a very important political issue domestically. Now, of course, this is all domestic, but I think it also has important international ramifications in one sense, in one important sense, that if you think about it, what it's going to do is that at least for domestic reasons, health reasons, the ability to price carbon to reflect domestic social marginal costs like health and congestion, I think the scope for that increases because of what's happening domestically. So really something very interesting in terms of the underlying dynamic, in terms of our ability to, price carbon to reflect domestic social marginal costs. I mean, at this stage, I think we should care less about international social marginal costs. I think we should care about it, but I think, there's the whole debate about who should contribute so much. But the fact that domestic politics will allow us to do that means that we can get closer and closer to, a higher pricing of carbon. So the excise tax on diesel, the coal cess, the forest incentivization, the solar program, and the domestic politics based on pollution, these are all things that have happened in the last few months. And really it has, I think, changes significantly what India is doing on climate change. We in India, I think, need to really focus on mitigation because for us, the consequences of not mitigating are huge. So in any international discussion, I don't think we should get sidetracked too much by adaptation. That's, for later, and, we deal with that. We have to focus primarily on mitigation because mitigation is a collective action problem. Adaptation is not a collective action problem. Adaptation is a local problem. We can deal with it when it happens. So focus on mitigation on any aspect, yeah? If that's the case, then given what we've done, we can go to Paris very confident about both with a stake in this, an enormous stake because we're going to be affected, but also very confident in our ability to contribute positively because we've taken so much action. So the question is, what should we ask for in Paris? I would say 2 things, really important things. One, that the West should immediately, quickly, ambitiously price carbon. Now, soon, $50, $70 per ton of CO2, whatever. It has to be quick, it has to be, because that's what's going to create the incentives for the private sector to start generating coal-related technologies and so on. So that's ask number 1. Ask number 2, big one, is there has to be a major global effort. We have to go on a war footing to invest in technologies to green and clean coal. Let me say why. Under any scenario, under any projection, India is going to use coal for 60 to 70%, you take your number, of its total energy use. So if you don't green coal, the planet blows up. You can do all you want on renewables, the planet blows up because China and India are going to continue to rely on coal. So you have to green coal, otherwise the climate change arithmetic doesn't add up. An aside here, we've all got enamored with renewables. I think renewables are very important, solar, wind, etc. But what's happened is that one of the casualties of our being so kind of preoccupied with renewables is that the incentive, the effort to invest in cleaning and greening coal has become a casualty. So I think, therefore, the 2 major asks for India should be price coal and go on a war footing to get to clean coal technologies. This is a thing about climate change finance, and I've said nothing about finance. The minister has spoken eloquently about finance. I don't understand finance. I don't pretend to know much about finance. But let me just raise questions about finance. If we focus a lot on finance, how does it alter the incentives for the West in this bargain? It's actually easy. I know it's going to be difficult, but given the politics, especially in the US and in some European countries, it may actually be easier for the West to provide finance than to take the actions that are really necessary to actually address the climate change problem, which is pricing carbon ambitiously, immediately, and going on a war footing on greening coal and finding clean technologies as substitutes for coal. So the international context is not very favorable. We've done a lot. We have a stake in Paris. We have to focus on really what are the key things that we need to mitigate climate change. And so I think a lot needs to be done in this regard. I will, wish the conference all success. I hope you come out with all kinds of new ideas. Thank you very much.